One of the things I find most interesting when two explorers get together is we sort of trade stories. This is Life's Tough, but Explorers Are Tougher. I'm your host, Richard Wiese. I love the outdoors. I always have, and I always will. I've heard stories that would make the hair on the back of your neck stand up. Explorers are the type of people who walk in space, go to the bottom of the ocean, and stand on the highest summits. Scratch the surface of any explorer, and you'll find they're all storytellers. This show is about their tales.
This episode is brought to you by the Podcast Services Division at Life's Tough Media. Having your own podcast allows you to creatively reach all types of audiences, from clients to prospects, to your most loyal membership base. And by utilizing studio affiliates located around the world, coupled with quality remote recording capabilities, Life's Tough Media makes having a corporate podcast easier than ever before. Contact us for a no-obligation consultation at info@lifestuff.com or visit lifestuff.com to learn more.
Greetings to you wherever you are in the world. I hope you're well. If you ever look at the night sky, there are always some stars that seem to shine a little brighter than others. The same holds true for the world of exploration. Our guest today is astronaut and newly minted president of the Explorers Club, Richard Garriott. If you listen to our previous Richard Garriott podcast, you learned that not only was Richard one of the pioneers of private space flight and the first father-son in space, Skylab astronaut Owen Garriott was his father, but created a video game empire seemingly to support his exploration habit. Richard Garriott, or as your mother used to call you, Unique Richard, welcome to the show.
Hey, Richard, other Richard, it's good to be back with you.
It's funny for, many people who don't know us, you and I have this sort of Laurel and Hardy routine when we call each other on the phone, and it usually goes, "Hi, Richard." And
Hi, Richard. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, Richard.
No, indeed, yeah. In fact, I think those of us our friends at the club are probably rather tired of that banter, but unfortunately, I think they're going to get a few more years of it.
So the last time you were on this podcast, you were in the news, and for allegedly smuggling the ashes of Scotty from Star Trek into space. Now you're in the news once again, and this time for being the first man to have flown into space and also go to the bottom of the ocean. So congratulations. And how'd that come about?
Yeah, thanks. No, well, yes, as you were careful to say, the first man to have gone space to the deep. And that's because one of our dear colleagues, Kathy Sullivan, was the first person to go from space to deep. She was actually expected to beat me by only about a week's time. We were actually going to be doing dives basically back to back, but there was started on her dive, and they tried to do one dive in between us and had some hardware trouble with the submarine or the submersible. And so they had to send it back in to do some refurbishment. But that meant it was about a 6-month delay before I finally got to dive. Just recently completed that, and now I've not only become the first man to have gone space to deep, but I'm actually the first person who's now done the 4 extremes of exploring the Earth from North Pole to South Pole, orbiting above it in space, and have dove to its deepest depths. So,
and just for those who are not familiar with the deepest point in the ocean, maybe you could tell them a little about that unique geographic location.
Yes, exactly. So we went down about 10,925 meters, to be close to exact, under the Pacific, into the Pacific at a place called the Mariana Trench and a specific spot called the Challenger Deep. And quite some time ago, there was a tall ship that had gone out and was sounding with the weights and ropes the depths of the world's ocean, and found this place referred to as the Challenger Deep. The ship was called the Challenger, and that place, which is out a couple hundred miles south of Guam in the Pacific, is where the Pacific plate and the Philippine plate meet and are pushing against each other. And then pushing against each other is kind of folding one down, and the Pacific plate is being subducted under the Philippine plate. That's not only creating the volcanic islands of the Philippines and Japan up and down that coast. It's about 1,500 miles long, this Mariana Trench. And the deepest point is called the Challenger Deep. And so it's almost 7 miles down below the surface in the Pacific.
So when you and I were growing up, it seemed like the paradigms of science as we knew it was there were 9 planets, which we know is no longer true, even within our own little space, and that life seemed to exist in a very narrow band between below boiling, above freezing, and the oceans, as I remember, it seemed like it was these lifeless, deep areas that were devoid of life. How have those paradigms shifted?
Well, those you enumerated those boundaries very well, and every one of those boundaries has now been not just exceeded, but we've actually shown that life is actually plentiful beyond those boundaries quite significantly. The one boundary that so far is still required, it still seems to be needed for life, is the existence of water. And so it turns out, however, that as long as you have that water can be way above 100 degrees Celsius boiling point, as long as there's pressure to keep it from physically boiling. The chemistry, and we now know there's life that lives in high acidity, very high base content. There's creatures that live in the ice that are called cryogenic extremophiles that live right at the interface between the Arctic and Antarctic rock or seawater, where life flourishes. There's even life now found inside the water, inside of nuclear power plants. There's even life that is hardened well enough to survive in those places. And so when we were down at the deep, one of the questions is what life are we going to find down there? And it turns out that even though Wikipedia still says the deepest life form known is, I think it says it's the snail fish that goes down to like 8,000 meters. Well, there are fish all the way down to 10,000 or almost 11,000 meters. And so if you put some bait down there in the bottom, which we did, there's a whole colonies, thousands and thousands of amphipods that will surround the bait that you put down there. There's extremophile bacterium that live in the mud and silts. It's really quite a bountiful place for life.
It's interesting because your initial entree into exploration was through your father, Owen Garriott. You grew up with astronauts all around you. You wanted to be an astronaut as a kid. One of the people helped create the private space flight because you had an eye condition that didn't allow you to go to space. So, space seemed like everything in your being was pointed towards that direction. What was the attraction to the Mariana Trench for you?
Well, what's interesting about exploring and what I discovered that I liked about exploring, starting from my first exploration memory was when we were on a family road trip around the country, and I found a little cave out behind this motel we were in, and I went in with a pack of matches to discover this magical, probably closet space giant cavern, and it is the getting into these places of awe and wonder that are on the one hand near enough by to reach, but on the other hand seem so alien and far away. I find those to be mystical, magical, and inspiring in a wide variety of ways. And pretty early on, I learned from my father, and really, frankly, both my parents, was also a little difference from the old Boy Scout adage. In the Boy Scouts, we always had the thing of when you're on a hike, take nothing but pictures, leave nothing but footprints. And my dad had another one that was, don't forget to bring back scientific samples. And so we did take a little more. But and we started doing that even as a young age. We would learn like, hey, you're in Yosemite with all the geysers. Well, that green scum there that's on the edge that people thought was inert, turns out that's life forms. Let's take a little scoop even if all you have is pour out an Avion water bottle and scoop up some water, let's send that to the lab and see what we find. And go ahead, please. I've been doing that.
I was about to say, I've actually witnessed that firsthand with you. You and I were on a fossil dig, and we were at a layer an iridium layer, which if anybody knows anything about the extinction of dinosaurs, when an asteroid hit the Yucatan Peninsula, there was this layer of quartz and iridium that happened. And I remember you taking a little vial, glass vial, or I think it was glass or plastic vial, and putting samples of that for your Richard Garriott Curios collection that I think that you have in every place that you call home.
No, that's exactly right. And so it was a plastic container. It still is downstairs right here. And yes, and that's, to me, that's part of the story. And so one of the cabinets of curiosities that I have here at the house is sort of the history of life on this planet. And anytime I can find another little piece to fit in between the pieces that I have to make the story more complete or more detailed, the more I appreciate it. And so there's that unique isotope of radioactive iridium that's in there that I have other radioactive materials in that same collection, and a little Geiger counter to go check it all out with. So yeah, it's part of the continuous story of the awesome environment we live in.
So speaking of awesome, becoming a father is a pretty awesome experience. And I know you're very close to your children, but if you reflect upon the combination of things that made, as your mother used to say, unique Richard, is that you had a father with very much an engineering mind, and your mother with an artistic mind. And that's, to me, that's almost a perfect blend to raise a kid. If a kid has curiosity and they can view things as an engineer and as an artist, that's a really nice meld that makes somebody maybe like Steve Jobs or yourself. Now, has that equation changed for you being a father? Because you had to get by on a lot of creativity as a kid. Astronauts don't make a huge amount. And so creativity becomes part of the formula for making you who you are. How do you now, when you're raising kids, kind of, everybody always kind of relates of how they were raised as a kid, and you're raising your kids part in New York City, part in Europe. How has that equation changed for you and your wife, Letitia?
Yeah, well, the good news for our kids is we don't have the exact same pairing, but we have a similar pairing, in the sense of, while I might represent both the sides of passion for art and science, the piece that I'm missing is part of the conservative business strategy, which my wife represents. And so, one of the reasons I was so successful as a game maker is I was partnered with my brother. And my brother was an engineer, so he knew the engineering side about as well as I did. But he also had a master's degree in business and had worked in finance companies before we went into business together. And so that pairing, for us to succeed in business, you really have to have all that together. If you're it's one thing to be able to make a grand piece of art, but as I discovered, unless you are partnered with a business person who can also retain your rights and knows how to sell it and make sure that they put the boundaries on, you better get it out by this date because the bank account will be empty if we don't finish by this certain time. Those are skills you also need. And so, my wife has those in complement to me. We partner on all the kind of investing that we do together, and a lot of the business things we do it together. And my kids are already clearly learning from both of us, where they know dad is the super creative one that they'll go have fun with, but they also know that, when it comes time to make sure that we're going to be able to do all these things, somebody better be in there planning the details properly. And my wife is much better than I am about making sure all the things line up properly.
Listen, your wife, Letitia, also buys into the art too, because and again, for those who are unaware, Richard has an alter ego. It's called Lord British, and Lord British was born. What year was Lord British born, Richard?
I don't even know. We'd never say that. He's from another planet, so it doesn't.
All right. Well, Lord British was part of his Ultima game videos, and Richard occasionally, for fun, dresses as Lord British, his kids as well. And this is really where I find the salesmanship in Richard comes in. His wife has bought into it and dresses as someone very exotic. I don't know what character she would be in one of your games, but your wife definitely has to have a sense of humor about that stuff.
Oh, no question. Well, in fact, her name in my most recent game is Arabella, and so she actually named her. She chose her own name, and she chose it after the name of the spider that my father took up on Skylab. So that's where the name comes from. But yes, well, not only does she dress in medieval garb when the family travels into those particular exotic lands, but as you also know well, when we go to the Explorers Club annual dinners, we, maybe half the time we'll wear normal tuxedos when we haven't found the right inspiration, but at least half the time we will come dressed as we have been inspired by recent exploration activities. And they can be literal, like costumes of the native dress of some of the places we visited, or it can be even more fanciful, like after we had done some Arctic exploring and we didn't want to just come in, in fur overcoats. We dressed much more fancifully like the runway with ice crowns and white and makeup with the sparklies all over our faces. So I mean, we have very loose interpretations of black tie.
I was trying to describe you to somebody the other day, and I said, Richard's my blue sky friend. I said, whatever I can blue sky, in other words, think of the big idea. Not only can Richard think of a bigger idea, but he also, in that same sentence, will tell you how you can legitimately implement it. So what is the big blue sky? Now you've been to space, you've been to the bottom of the ocean, you're raising super creative kids, you got the trophy wife at the first go of marriage. So what's next, Richard?
Well, the good news that you fundamentally obviously know as well as I do is that this planet that we live on, first of all, has vast areas that remain to be explored. And interestingly, and it's not just the obvious places like 80% of the ocean is still unexplored. Even on the surface, even on the deserts of this earth, as the sand dunes roll by, they're exposing lost ancient cities that were lost under the sand thousands of years ago that some of our colleagues are still finding to this day. So there's still just tons of things to find right here on terra firma. But obviously, you also know that I'm really very much interested in space, and I have been so frustrated since the retirement of Apollo, which was when my dad flew, that we have been stuck in low Earth orbit for the rest of my life, for 30 more than 30 years, almost 40 years. And the thing I'm particularly excited about is not only are we seeing this move back out to the moon and beyond, but we're seeing it led by private industry, not just governments. In fact, this upcoming year is the first time the majority of people manifested to fly into space are flying privately, not as a government astronaut. And when I talked to folks like Elon, which I did literally just a couple weeks ago, he said, yeah, that trend is
Elon Musk, just so people, if they didn't realize who Elon was, that's Elon Musk. Go ahead, Richard.
Elon Musk, he was saying, yeah, even the non-published data about what's further beyond that year out, he's going like, yeah, this trend appears to him to be continuing, that the increase in private exploration or commercial exploration taking over from government-led exploration is going to continue. And I'm very bullish on that. I helped bring that industry into existence, I would like to believe. And I believe our future as humanity is as a multi-planet species, as a species that will live, in space permanently and on other planetary bodies permanently, and eventually will even move beyond the solar system in the grand scheme of time. But I'm very hopeful that here in our lifetimes, and very much right at the core of our kids' time on this planet, they'll have the option to live on other planets.
Richard, you're going to be presiding over, I guess it best describe it as the Davos of exploration in Portugal in July. What are your sort of hopes that the rest of the world sees about science and exploration from an event like this?
Well, one of the things I think that the club has been particularly good at, but this event will punctuate to or make this more true for the general public than we've been able to do previously at the Explorers Club, is show how the combination of the importance of exploration and what can be explored and how that is now being done, kind of the how this is being accomplished these days. So those are kind of three fronts. I think people are coming around. Science has been, I think, battered for some years, but I think people are now coming around to the importance of a scientific understanding of the reality in which we live, and how that matters, not just to the hypothetical science you need to make a cell phone, but in the practical science of what it's going to take to survive on the planet. And so I think people are recognizing that. Then part two, showing them that, by the way, there are still so many things we don't know about this planet. Like for us as explorers, we've been hearing about microplastics in all the water on Earth now for maybe a decade. But, while people are hearing this story about, people are now understand, I think broadly, that climate change is a big issue. Well, to me, right behind that is plastics. We now have, plastic feeding into the bottom of our food chain, working its way up the food chain in ways that will be very hard to address, and is just now really being studied deeply. And then you go to the third prong I mentioned, which was, how are we doing this? And I think people, again, for maybe a decade have, especially if you're an explorer, have understood that, the value of satellite telemetry to understand things like weather, or how crops are growing, and stresses on crops around the world. But people may not have been as familiar with these wonderful technologies that are coming online now, like what I recently got a chance to ride with our Explorers Club medalist, Victor Vescovo, in his submersible that he built called Limiting Factor, which is the first vehicle that has been able to make full ocean dive depths anywhere on the world. Now has, they're up to 60, 70 dives now, I think, in total. And this capability, and like it, there's others like it. I was another one of our fellow members, Alan Eustace, who did a space dive. I literally had an email exchange with him recently where he's up to build submarines, or automated autonomous ocean vehicles to help map the oceans again. And so, anyway, we just have explorers building and using extraordinary technologies to go find ways to bring back the data and inspiration we need from, every corner on Earth, much less the new, final frontier of space.
Yeah, and I've also heard you talk about, when you talk about science communication, which I know is important to you, but you've also talked about, the diversity of exploration. And when we say diversity, that, Westerners, European Americans like ourselves aren't the only ones with unique ideas. And I know that that's been something that's personally been very important to you.
Yeah, and again, what I think is exciting about this moment in time is that for even us as the Explorers Club, we started back in 1904 as a gentleman's club. It took us longer than it probably should have to welcome in the other half of explorers on the planet. But still, most history books of the golden age of exploration in the turn of last century, still are really very heavily biased towards the European explorer and country that was funding often those expeditions. What we're now learning is, first of all, even for those trips, the people who did the real work were not those wealthy Europeans that paid for it. The people that actually did most of the hard work and actually much of the discovery were the indigenous or regional people who lived closest to the place that was being explored and already sort of knew it well, like the back of their hand. And we're not only celebrating those people much more appropriately now than we used to, but what we're finding now, and this recent work that actually you helped lead with this Explorers Club 50 program they put together last year, really showed us that if we do one simple thing, which is to, instead of focusing on the oldest generation who has accomplished the most and give them hooray for climbing or whatever it is that they've done, if instead we look to the younger generation, that is the people who are really now solving these, we have really grand challenges as a planet right now that we are facing. It is the young generation that is going to bring back the science and the understanding and be the people to inspire all of humanity to address these grand challenge issues. So if we just go, who are those people that are doing that best work? By definition, they're all over the planet. By definition, they're therefore from every culture. By definition, they're therefore of both genders and every ethnicity, and they're all amazing people. And so that simple switch, I think, has shown us a really bright light as to not only the diversity of exploration and explorers themselves, but also on that there really are great, despite the world's troubles, there are great positive examples of people working very hard to solve problems great and small.
I couldn't agree more. And Richard, thank you so much for not only coming on the show, but you know, you make exploration and science exciting. You make it accessible, and life has, life is tough sometimes, but it's always great to know that there's someone out there just, trying to sort of put a new spin on it and make it fun and lively and relevant for everybody. So thank you very much for being a guest today.
Oh, you're very kind, Richard. I appreciate it very much. I'm happy to come back anytime.
I will definitely have you. Okay, Richard, thanks.
Welcome.